It's the 24th of April, 1184 BC. Roughly 30 men are crouched inside a giant sculpture made out of wood, shaped like a horse. They have been in there for hours. They cannot speak, they cannot move, they can barely breathe. Outside, just a few centimeters of wood was between them and the Trojans celebrating. They hear music, laughter, wine being poured. The city of Troy is throwing a party because the Greeks are gone. Their ships had sailed that very morning. The 10-year war is over. Troy has survived. The giant horse that was brought inside the city walls was left at the gates by the Greeks. It was a surrender offering, a trophy to show they had lost the war, a gift for the gods. What the Trojans did not know was that this would be the most genius move of deception the world would ever see. Out of the warriors inside the Trojan horse, one of the men is not just a soldier, he is the reason they are all here. His name is Odysseus, and this is how he tricked an entire empire. Odysseus was born on Ithaca, a small island off the western coast of Greece, not particularly wealthy or powerful. His grandfather was Autolycus, a man the ancient sources describe as the greatest thief and liar of his generation. A man who could look you in the eye and convince you the sky was green. This is not incidental. Odysseus inherited something specific from that bloodline. Not dishonesty exactly, something more precise. The ability to understand what another person wants to believe and to give it to them. He was also, by all accounts, a genuinely gifted fighter. This is important. Odysseus is often reduced to the clever one, the schemer, the man in the shadows. But he wins the archery contest in his own palace at the end of his life against men 20 years younger. He is strong, he is brave. He chooses cunning over brute force not because he can't fight, but because he understands winning a fight costs something. Winning without fighting costs nothing. When the call came to join the war against Troy, Odysseus did not want to go. This is one of the most revealing details in all of ancient literature. Every other Greek king raced to answer Agamemnon's summons. The war promised glory, plunder, and the kind of eternal fame that Greeks valued above almost everything else. Odysseus saw something different. He saw a long war, a hard war, a war fought 3 weeks of sailing from home. So, he pretended to be mad. When the Greek envoys arrived at Ithaca, Odysseus walked out to meet them. He was wearing a farmer's hat. He had yoked a horse and an ox together, 2 animals that can't actually work in tandem, and he was plowing his fields and sowing salt into the furrows. These were the acts of a man who had completely lost his mind. The Greeks were not fooled for long. He had to go to war. The war that followed lasted 10 years, a decade of siege warfare outside the walls of Troy. Troy was not an easy target. The city sat on a high ridge overlooking the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. Its walls were massive, thick stone, carefully maintained, built to withstand exactly what the Greeks were trying to do. No Greek army had managed to breach them in a decade of trying. The Trojans had no reason to come out and fight. They had supplies. They had allies sending reinforcements. They had walls that the Greeks simply could not break. Every time the Greeks attempted a direct assault, the defenders had the advantage of height, of cover, and of knowing exactly where the attack was coming from. This is the strategic situation Odysseus inherited. Not a battle, a stalemate. And a stalemate in ancient warfare almost always favored the defender. The conventional response was to keep trying, to send more men at the walls, to find a better battering ram, to wait out the defenders until their supplies ran out. The Greeks had been doing this for 10 years. It hadn't worked. The plan he developed was so simple, it was almost offensive. Build a giant wooden horse, leave it outside the city gates, sail away. That is the entire plan. And the reason it worked is not because it was complicated. It is because Odysseus understood the Trojan mind better than the Trojans understood themselves. The Greeks had been camped outside Troy for 10 years. The Trojans had watched them every single day. They had developed a picture of who these people were, how they thought, what they valued. They knew the Greeks worshipped the goddess Athena. They knew the Greeks believed in omens, in sacred objects, in divine favor. And they knew that when a war finally ended, the losing side was expected to offer something to the gods. Odysseus gave them exactly what they expected to see. A defeated army, sailing home in shame, leaving behind a religious offering to the goddess who had failed them. The horse was enormous, far too large and heavy to have any military purpose. It was clearly an offering. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Except for the men hiding inside it. The Trojans debated what to do. Some wanted to burn it. A Trojan priestess named Cassandra stood at the gates and screamed that it was a trick, that it would be the death of them all. She had the gift of prophecy and the curse of never being believed. The Trojan priest Laocoon threw a spear at the horse's side. He told the crowd to remember that the Greeks bore gifts. Then 2 sea serpents rose from the ocean and killed him and his sons in front of the crowd. This was not Odysseus. This was coincidence, or fate, or the gods. But Odysseus had created conditions where even coincidence worked in his favor. The death of the one man who might have stopped them was read as divine punishment for doubting the offering. The Trojans dragged the horse inside the walls themselves. They threw a party. The war was over. They had survived 10 years of Greek aggression. They drank, celebrated, and eventually fell asleep. At some point in the small hours of the night, a trapdoor opened in the belly of the horse. The Greek soldiers dropped silently to the ground, moved through the darkened streets, and opened the city gates from the inside. The fleet, which had only sailed as far as a nearby island, returned. Troy was taken not by force, but by invitation. The Trojans had carried the Greeks past their own walls and locked them safely inside. The city burned for days. But this is not simply a story about one famous trick. Because the Trojan horse was not an accident. He had been solving impossible problems for a decade. Earlier in the war, when Greek morale had collapsed and Agamemnon had made the catastrophic decision to test his troops by pretending to offer them the chance to go home, it was Odysseus who physically ran through the camp, stopping soldiers from boarding their ships. He understood that Agamemnon's test had backfired completely, that 10 years of exhaustion had come pouring out the moment the men were given permission to leave. These men needed a reason to stay. He gave a speech. He reminded them of a prophecy. A prophet by the name of Calchas said he saw an omen of a snake eating a mother bird and her 9 chicks, which he interpreted to mean that the Greeks would fight for 9 years and finally conquer Troy in the 10th year. They were in the 10th year. To leave now was to abandon guaranteed victory for guaranteed shame. This speech was why the soldiers stayed. He did the same thing with information. The Greeks needed to steal a sacred statue. The statue is known as the Palladium, a wooden idol of the goddess Athena. According to myth, Troy could not be captured as long as the statue remained inside the city walls. Odysseus volunteered for the mission, entered the heavily fortified city disguised as a beggar, filthy and beaten, completely unrecognizable. He stole the statue and brought it back to the Greek camp, and he used the time inside the walls to observe the layout of the city, the positions of the guards, the rhythms of daily life. Every piece of intelligence went into a picture of Troy that he carried in his head for years. The Trojan horse was not a sudden idea. It was the conclusion of a decade of watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to use everything he knew. The war ended, Troy burned, and Odysseus tried to go home. But the journey home didn't go as planned, and it took him 10 more years. He would eventually arrive home alone, dressed as a beggar, to find his palace full of men competing to marry his wife. and consume his estate. Odysseus, with the help of his son Telemachus, slaughtered every one of the suitors in his great hall. He arrived in disguise, he surveyed the situation, he identified which of his servants had stayed loyal and which had betrayed him. He positioned his son at the exits, he removed all the weapons from the hall, then he triggered the slaughter on his own terms. The man who tricked an empire came home and tricked the men who had taken his house. He then identified himself to his wife Penelope, who had spent 20 years waiting for him, and they were reunited. Even in destruction, Odysseus planned. Eventually, Odysseus would die. According to some ancient sources, he was killed by a son he didn't know he had, Telegonus, a son born to the witch Circe during his years of wandering. After the events of the Odyssey, Telegonus left his mother's island in search of his father. He accidentally landed on Ithaca, and not knowing who the islanders were, raided their cattle for food. Odysseus and his men defended the cattle. In the ensuing battle, neither men recognized each other, and Telegonus would strike and fatally wound Odysseus with a spear. The spear was tipped with the spine of a stingray, fulfilling the prophecy that Odysseus would meet his death from the sea. A man who could outthink every opponent, every king, every god who moved against him, who built plans so carefully layered that coincidence itself seemed to work in his favor, who understood human nature with a precision that bordered on something inhuman. He could not outthink what he didn't know.